To understand Machiavelli, you must first step inside the Florence of his youth, a city that dazzled with artistic brilliance yet suffocated under political tension. Born in 1469, Machiavelli entered a world where beauty and brutality lived side by side. Florence called itself a republic, but everyone knew who truly held the reins. The Medici family, with their immense wealth and subtle iron grip, shaped the city's destiny from behind velvet curtains. This was a Renaissance, an age of rebirth in art and science, but not necessarily in peace. Italy was not a unified nation, but a fractured mosaic of small states. Venice, Milan, Naples, the Papal States, each locked in a continuous struggle for dominance. Alliances formed and collapsed overnight. Betrayals were common currency. Assassinations could be arranged as easily as marriages. Diplomacy was an elegant mask worn over a chaotic battlefield. Machiavelli grew up watching this theater of ambition unfold at every corner. He saw envoys negotiating with smiles at daggers, noble families shifting loyalties to survive, and rulers gaining or losing their power not through virtue but through cunning. The streets themselves were lessons in political anatomy. Power was won by those who understood human nature at its most vulnerable points. These experiences did more than influence Machiavelli. They forged him. They stripped politics of its idealized aura and revealed its raw mechanics. While earlier thinkers imagined governance as a moral pursuit, Machiavelli saw it as a living organism driven by fear, desire, and necessity. His realism was not born from theory, but from witnessing the instability of Italian states, the cruelty of warlords, and the fragile illusion of public virtue. By the time he began writing, Machiavelli no longer believed that politics could be guided by high-minded principles alone. He had lived too close to the fire, and Florence, with its conspiracies and shifting powers, had taught him a lesson he would never forget, that behind every political triumph lies a story of strategy, risk, and the unsentimental pursuit of survival. Machiavelli's political vision begins with a rupture, an intentional break with centuries of moral tradition. Where earlier thinkers insisted that a good ruler must first be a good person, Machiavelli dismantles this assumption with the precision of someone who has watched ideals collapse under the weight of reality. For him, politics does not operate within the same moral framework that governs private life. Power has its own laws, its own logic, and its own brutal necessities. At the heart of his philosophy lies a simple but unsettling premise. The success of a ruler should not be measured by moral purity, but by effectiveness. If maintaining stability requires deception, intimidation, or even cruelty, then these tools become legitimate, sometimes indispensable. Morality, in Machiavelli's eyes, is not abandoned but subordinated to the survival of the state. This leads to one of his most famous insights, the tension between being loved and being feared. Love, he argues, is fragile. It bends under pressure, dissolves when circumstances change, and depends on the goodwill of others, something no ruler can fully control. Fear, however, operates on a deeper instinct. It produces obedience because it carries consequences. And while Machiavelli does not encourage gratuitous brutality, he insists that fear is a far more reliable foundation of authority than affection. Yet Machiavelli's realism does not end there. He understands that power is also a performance. A ruler must appear virtuous, compassionate, honest, just, even when circumstances demand the opposite. People judge what they see, not what is hidden. Thus, the leader able to cloak strategic ruthlessness beneath a facade of moral integrity gains the advantage. Politics becomes an art of controlled illusion. Ultimately, Machiavelli is not celebrating cruelty or deceit. He is confronting the uncomfortable truth that governance requires decisions ordinary morality cannot always accommodate. In a world driven by ambition, fear, and instability, he believes that the ruler who clings naively to idealism is destined to fall. The one who understands human nature and is willing to act accordingly stand a chance not only to survive, but to shape history. To grasp Machiavelli's thought at its core, one must open The Prince, a work that reads less like a philosophical treatise and more like a manual for surviving political turbulence. Written in 1513, it offers not abstract theories but a toolkit, specific principles, strategic insights, and warnings gathered from years of diplomatic observation. Machiavelli is not interested in describing how rulers should behave. He is focused on how they must behave if they hope to endure. Central to this guide is the concept of virtue, a term impossible to reduce to a single English word. It is not virtue in the moral sense, but a composite of qualities: audacity, intelligence, adaptability, courage, and a sharp understanding of human motivations. A leader with virtue does not wait for circumstances to align. He shapes them. He knows when to act boldly, when to delay, and when to seize opportunities that others fail to recognize. Standing opposite virtue is fortune, the unpredictable force that sweeps through human affairs like a storm. Fortune represents everything outside human control: luck, external events, shifting alliances, sudden chaos. Machiavelli does not deny its power. Instead, he argues that a capable ruler must build defenses against it. His famous metaphor compares fortune to a violent river. When calm, it can be managed and contained. When it floods, it destroys everything unprepared. Virtue, therefore, is the art of anticipating these floods and erecting safeguards before disaster strikes. Throughout The Prince, Machiavelli uses examples from history, most famously Cesare Borgia, to illustrate leaders who mastered this delicate interplay between virtue and fortune. Borgia's strategic brilliance, his calculated use of force, and his ability to appear just even while acting ruthlessly made him, in Machiavelli's eyes, a model of effective rulership. Though Borgia ultimately fell due to unforeseen events, Machiavelli argues that his downfall was caused not by lack of skill, but by the overwhelming weight of fortune. The book also exposes a deeper critique: the gap between moral ideals and political realities. Ruling a state, Machiavelli insists, is not an exercise in maintaining personal goodness, but in safeguarding authority and stability. A leader who clings to moral absolutes in a treacherous world is like an architect who ignores a terrain. Noble intentions cannot withstand structural flaws. The Prince is thus both a caution and an invitation, a stark reminder that power demands vigilance, and an encouragement to master the forces that shape political fate. When Machiavelli's ideas reappear in modern conversations, they tend to provoke an immediate reaction: fascination, discomfort, or even suspicion. Yet the reason his name still carries such weight is simple. His analysis of power feels uncannily relevant in an era where political life is constantly exposed, scrutinized, and debated. The world may have traded swords for microphones and city-states for global institutions, but the dynamics of influence remain strikingly familiar. Machiavelli forces us to confront a question that still troubles contemporary politics. Can a leader be both effective and moral? For many, the answer seems to shift depending on the moment. When crises erupt, economic collapse, war, pandemics, citizens often demand a kind of decisive, uncompromising action that aligns more with Machiavellian realism than with philosophical idealism. It is in these moments of pressure that the tension between ethics and necessity becomes visible. Comparing Machiavelli to earlier thinkers highlights this tension even more clearly. Plato believed that rulers should embody wisdom and justice, guiding the state like guardians of moral truth. Rousseau insisted that legitimate power must reflect the general will and uphold human goodness. Machiavelli, however, strips away these aspirations and examines politics as it appears in real life: fragmented, unpredictable, driven by competing interests rather than universal virtue. This perspective does not make him an advocate of cruelty. Instead, it makes him a diagnostician of political anatomy. He understands that leaders operate within environments shaped by human fear, ambition, and instability. His realism becomes especially evident when we look at figures like Winston Churchill or Franklin D. Roosevelt, leaders who made difficult, often morally ambiguous decisions in moments where hesitation could have cost entire nations. Their actions echo Machiavelli's belief that leadership sometimes demands choices outsiders may never fully comprehend. At the same time, Machiavelli's relevance today raises interesting ethical debates. Modern societies expect transparency, accountability, and moral consistency from their leaders, expectations that often conflict with the strategic opacity Machiavelli describes. Can honesty coexist with political survival? Is strategic communication simply manipulation under another name? In a world of public scrutiny, how much Machiavellianism is acceptable or even necessary? His philosophy does not settle these questions. Rather, it keeps them alive. By exposing the friction between ideals and realities, Machiavelli provides a lens through which we can examine modern power without illusions. whether we admire him or reject him. His insights compel us to acknowledge the complexity of leadership in a world where morality and necessity rarely align perfectly. To understand Machiavelli's originality, it helps to place him beside the thinkers who shaped political thought before and after him. His ideas do not exist in isolation. They stand in deliberate tension with entire philosophical traditions. That tension is precisely what makes his work so provocative. Begin with Plato, who imagined the ideal ruler as a philosopher, someone guided by wisdom, justice, and a deep understanding of the good. In Plato's world, politics is a moral pursuit, almost a spiritual responsibility. Machiavelli counters this vision with startling bluntness. For him, politics is not a sanctuary for virtue, but a battlefield governed by necessity. Where Plato elevates rulers to a higher moral plane, Machiavelli drags them back into the dirt, where real decisions must be made under pressure, uncertainty, and human imperfection. Then consider Thomas Hobbes, who, like Machiavelli, adopts a dark view of human nature. Hobbes sees humans as driven by fear, desire, and self-preservation, and he argues that only an absolute sovereign can prevent society from collapsing into chaos. Yet despite these similarities, Hobbes differs in one crucial respect. He believes a sovereign's primary role is to ensure order and safety. Machiavelli, by contrast, focuses not on the preservation of peace, but on the preservation of power itself. Hobbes imagines a stable system. Machiavelli imagines a ruler constantly navigating shifting dangers. With Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the contrast becomes even sharper. Rousseau insists that humans are naturally good and that society corrupts them. Political legitimacy, he argues, must reflect the general will, not the ambitions of individual leaders. For Machiavelli, however, political life begins with conflict, not harmony. Ambition, deception, and competition are not corruptions of human nature. They are human nature. Rousseau builds politics on trust and shared ideals. Machiavelli builds on vigilance and strategic calculation. Finally, enter Nietzsche, who appears centuries later yet resonates with Machiavelli in intriguing ways. Both men distrust conventional morality, seeing it as a tool created by the weak to constrain the strong. Both value strength, creativity, and the ability to shape one's own destiny. But where Machiavelli applies this insight primarily to political leadership, Nietzsche pushes it inward, toward the individual striving to transcend herd values and create new ones. Machiavelli focuses on the art of governing others, Nietzsche on the art of governing oneself. Through these comparisons, Machiavelli emerges not as a philosopher of cruelty, but as a thinker who breaks with comforting illusions. He refuses to describe the world as it ought to be, and instead confronts it as it is, messy, unstable, and driven by forces most philosophers prefer to ignore. In doing so, he reshapes the entire landscape of political thought, offering an alternative to idealism that continues to challenge our assumptions about leadership, morality, and the nature of power. What makes Machiavelli endure is not only the sharpness of his political insights, but the moral unease they generate. His work forces us into a territory most thinkers avoid, the uncomfortable space where ethics and necessity collide. In this space, leaders face decisions with no clean answers, choices that demand sacrifice, deception, or force, not because they're desirable, but because the alternative may be collapse. Machiavelli compels us to look at this reality without turning away. The central dilemma he exposes is simple yet disturbing. How far should a leader go to preserve power, and at what cost? Critics argue that Machiavelli clears a path for tyranny, that he legitimizes manipulation and cruelty by presenting them as tools of governance. If power can excuse anything, then almost any injustice can be rationalized. This fear has long fueled his reputation as a dangerous advisor to the ruthless. But Machiavelli can also be read differently, not as a cheerleader for immorality, but as a realist confronting the darker side of leadership. He reminds us that politics deals not only with ideals, but with survival. A ruler who refuses to act decisively, even harshly, in times of crisis may condemn their people to greater suffering. History is filled with leaders who hesitated when courage was needed or clung to moral purity, while their states crumbled around them. For Machiavelli, inaction can be its own form of cruelty. This tension becomes clearer when we look at modern leaders who face extraordinary pressure. Figures like Churchill or Roosevelt made decisions that would be morally unthinkable in ordinary times. Yet they acted because the stakes were existential. Their choices echo the Machiavellian insight that leadership often demands stepping into ethical territory that ordinary citizens never have confront. Still, Machiavelli does not offer a soothing justification. He leaves us suspended in uncertainty. His writings illuminate the complexity of power, but do not resolve its contradictions. They reveal that leadership can demand actions at conflict with personal virtue, that the boundary between necessary force and moral corruption is thin, and that crossing can sometimes be both unavoidable and unforgivable. Ultimately, Machiavelli's legacy is a mirror held up to human nature and political life. It reflects ambition and fear, brilliance and brutality, courage and compromise. He does not tell us what to believe. He demands that we examine what we are. His work whispers a question that each generation of leaders must wrestle with anew. In a world of fragile order and unpredictable danger, what price are we willing to pay for stability, and who must pay it on our behalf?